Georg Kell, thanks for joining us. First question is, with nationalism and political tribalism on the rise and governments in some cases radically redefining their roles and objectives, where does this leave business?
Well, business has to learn to adjust to regulatory divergences. Remember, Jeff, when we were active at the United Nations, the paradigm was it's an open world with a liberal order, rule-based, and there are universal concepts that apply everywhere. Sadly, we're in a new era now where governments are back in the driver's seat. At the core of that is a strategic rivalry for power between the US and China. But in between are many other rivalries. So old power concepts are back, governments are back. COVID also and the fiscal stimuli that went with it and the easy money phase of central banks added also to government interferences at a much bigger scale as we had seen since the financial crisis. And now we really see a world where national interests dominate everything. That's very sad. It's at the expense of efficiencies, by the way. It is also becoming a driver of inflation. Economists don't recognize that yet, but there's a price to be paid for inefficiencies. We see business has to play by different rules in different markets, which adds transaction costs, complexities, and uncertainties. Life has become more difficult, no doubt.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have this kind of G0 world that Ian Bremmer talks a lot about, which gives greater complexity. We see companies divesting of Russia, for example, which was unimaginable a year ago.
Russia is a special case, I would argue, because Russia violated the UN Charter in a very brutal way, attacked the sovereign member states, if you so want. So that is open war. That is really a very special case. And Russia, Americans used to say it's just a big gas station. And it's not just a gas station. They obviously have been exporting lots of other commodities. And that has added to the disruption effect of the hangover of COVID and amplified these disruptions. But what is really now cooking in the background is the US-China rivalry that increasingly forces other countries to take a side one way or the other. So there's a new complexity added to that. And then we have a couple of regional uncertainties in Latin America. There are some obvious cases, the upcoming elections in Brazil and so forth. So there's plenty of political rumbling going on and plenty of redefinition. Basically, it's a fragmentation into power blocks. Europe is weak at some level, economically strong, but militarily weak, completely depending on the US for the time being. China is trying to establish itself as a regional power, at least. The claim on Taiwan, which used to be an integral part of China for thousands of years anyway, I would argue, and I have to add here, like the Basque territory of Spain. But it's a complicated world. It's very sad, actually, that these old power concepts are back, because we thought that as knowledge is now the foundation of economic activities more and more so, yes, commodities still matter. The physical world matters a lot. But we assume that value adding has shifted towards knowledge-intense activities, and therefore occupying land or conquering land has lost its attractiveness. Homo sapiens, remember these nice things and so forth. But clearly, Homo sapiens has not yet arrived. Yeah. There's a fall back into old ideologies as well, imperial mindsets, and all sorts of weird things of the past.
That's right. So if we think of ESG, corporate responsibility, corporate citizenship, and the work we did at the Global Compact as a set of kind of global values, how does the company get the balance right between onboarding these global values and living those, but then also realizing local context and cultural relativism?
I think there is a new challenge. Companies have to redefine the boundaries by market almost. But I would argue for companies to be strong for the future, they should distinguish three dimensions. First, they should ask themselves, what do we control? Then the second pocket is, what can we influence? And the third pocket is where we have neither control nor influence. What can we inspire in alignment with our strategic objectives? On the control side, your operations, where you hire, you fire, you should always, everywhere, aspire to the highest standard. Because with the higher standard, you can compete anywhere. And downsizing standards doesn't pay off. It's costly and it's full of risks. So where you control, higher standards. Where you have influence but no control, say in your supply chain or in some partnerships, try to make your influence work as best as you can. So your values, your ideas about how to run a company are reflected as best as you can. Obviously, you don't control, but you have influence. Make your influence work. Where you have neither control nor influence, you can still inspire. With good practices, you can build your brand. With living the good values, you can inspire communities beyond your influence and also contribute to your long-term success. So I find this need for redefining boundaries. It's painful, but you have to do it. You have to do it by market. You have to watch closely the regulatory side, which is shifting rapidly these days, especially on the ESG front. We have 3,000 new ESG regulation worldwide in the last 10 years. Imagine that. Covers all sorts of issues from plastic to emissions and so forth. So keep an eye on regulatory changes and adjust by market.
That's great. So you mentioned ESG. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution? I mean, you were one of the pioneers in this space, the late 90s when the Global Compact started to spin up. And now we've had this ESG kind of revolution. But they're all kind of carrying with them, their terms are carrying with them their own baggage, if you will. Talk a little bit about where this is all going.
Yeah, it's actually quite amazing how the ESG notion has taken hold of everything now. The initial idea was and still is that ESG speaks to the materially relevant issues, environmental, social, and governance. Financially, what matters, yeah? And this was the idea to win over investors. And the ESG movement started with asset owners. Who Cares Wins with my good friend Gavin. And later on then in 2014, some economists at Harvard and elsewhere established correlations between good ESG factor management on the one hand and long-term valuation on the other. And that's what really got financial industries, Wall Street, Shanghai, and everybody excited. And that's where the real mainstreaming started. Now, corporates realizing that finance is actually sensitized on these issues, of course, want to increase their valuation. So they also embrace now the ESG terminology to better communicate with finance on these issues. So in a way, you can argue the circle is closing. The terminology behind it is not complex. ESG is a very big tent. It allows for many factors to feed into there, or localization, context specifics, dovetails well with corporate sustainability, especially on the materially relevant dimensions. So I'm delighted to see that happening on such a big scale. Over 1/3 of professionally managed money worldwide is already somehow ESG aligned in one way or the other. And technology is playing a major role here because technology allows the management and application of this data for financial analysts, which wasn't possible before. Remember, Jeff, we always knew that a good managed company intuitively also understands that good environmental stewardship, good social relations, good workers' relations, and good governance issues are a prerequisite for long-term success. But we couldn't really communicate the value-creating dimension of these activities. It was like an insurance policy. Okay, you are good on the sustainability side. It makes you future-proof. It is like an insurance against risks, but we could show the benefits, the financial benefits that immediately come from it. And ESG allows that to get a better handle. I may add that my own startup, Arabesque, is thriving in that space. We are now the world's largest independent ESG data provider. And I know a little bit what's going on the technology front there. It's amazing how fast the pace of improvements is happening. So increasingly, the ESG data is more updated, more forward-looking. It allows investors to make ever more informed additional information based on this ESG data. So it's a positive development from my angle. Now regulators are catching up, and that's where complications come in. In the US, the SEC is about to prepare a disclosure requirement. And that, of course, causes a backlash. And that's why we have this funny debate on ESG going on. in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. It's all politically motivated. In Europe, we have the green taxonomy, SFDR, and so forth. In Asia, some markets are also defining new regulation based on ESG. It is going into the DNA of markets now.
You mentioned long-term value creation. How's the balance being struck between analysts oftentimes trying to maximize short-term versus the long-term benefits of ESG?
We have to be honest. Financial markets still are to a large extent short-term oriented. It simply still is profitable to burn the globe, to put it bluntly. You can get rich by illegal logging in the Amazon or other activities. You save a lot of money if you dump toxic waste in your backyard and not being caught, or going into jurisdictions where there is no law for it. But you also know that the downside risks with such behavior is tremendously increasing. There's a simple way of analyzing the changing framework conditions. One can, on the one hand, recognize the cyclical changes. One has to pay attention, obviously, macroeconomics, but also disruptions that stem from COVID in a way are not permanent. They come and then something else happens out of it. We have political changes. Sadly, they stay for quite a while, but in a way, politics also moves in cycles, depending on region and country, obviously, and globally. But the two trends that reshape framework conditions for business that are here to stay, that are irreversible, are technology and natural boundaries. They are both permanently reshaping the framework conditions, and they're both accelerating. Technological change is accelerating, convergence of different technologies, and the importance of tackling natural boundary, natural asset issues is increasingly pressing from the climate agenda, from the water agenda, and so forth. So recognizing these two mega trends fully and informing your strategic thinking from a corporate angle is very important. And if you focus on the overlap of technology and natural boundaries, then you are clearly in a sweet spot. That's a future growth area. So that is the best advice I can give from the disruptive evolution of our market trends.
What's most exciting you in the space right now?
Right now, on the data side, I'm really thrilled to see how ESG data 2.0 is in the making, meaning it's increasingly possible to more precisely measure environmental performance and related issues, and to use that for decision making. That is really exciting. I'm also excited to see that despite the onset of depressions or recessions in various countries, venture capital for green investment is not declining. On the contrary, I see a lot of innovation happening around the world, also at the corporate level, who in times of disruptions do not just downsize, but rather recognize that this is an opportunity to reinvent our business model and to innovate, which confirms the age-old knowledge that in times of crisis, there's an opportunity for renewal. So I hope that many corporates will grasp this opportunity to reinvent and to build for a stronger future and be prepared for growth.
That's fabulous. I know you recently became a grandfather. Congratulations.
Thank you, Jeff.
That's probably another adventure and another thing that's exciting you. It's always a pleasure, Georg. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you, Jeff. All the best.
Take care.